a recognition of the really the romantic character of poverty, the romantic character of the people living on the extreme of life. See, nothing is more appalling to the romantic than to think of somebody who's middle-aged, slightly fat, standing in front of his small house in a small town in the sunlight at noon. That vision is horrifying to him. If you aren't either very young or very old, if you aren't either very lean or enormously fat, if you aren't, in other words, exercising some of your capacities for the extremes, you are nothing. Until you're really, in a way, invisible. So the whole world is turned over, and you begin to see people, only the people that have some extravagance or extremity in their lives or in themselves. Let's look at the next one. This picture could not have been painted any other time. And here you have the wonderful bourgeoisie, also painted by David. It's so nice to see them after seeing aristocratic portraits, because they're just plump there, and they just stare right out at you, and they are rich. And that's all. I mean, that's what they are, and there they are. It's such a refreshing thing to see, you know. Let's look at the next art, after the revolution. Now, one of the things that happens is that the artist becomes the hero of the time. And this is a painting of a young man in an artist's studio by an artist who lived out the perfect romantic life exactly, again, as if he were following the script. A man named Géricault. He was born really the year of the French Revolution. He was born in 91, and he lived till 1825. In other words, he dies at 34. He dies by violence. He's thrown from a horse and is injured and dies from the injury. And everything that he touches and everything that he is a fulfillment of the sense of the power of the emotional life, of the importance of it, and of what's called the creative genius or creative imagination. And he fulfills this in himself, and he fulfills it in what he paints. And he is this kind, exactly as this person who's unknown fulfills this expectation of what the artist must be, what the person must be, and what the artist supremely is. Eccentric. And one of the things which the artist must do is be melancholy. It's an extraordinary thing that melancholy becomes a sign of virtue in a philosophy or an idea that promises endless ecstasy. But instead, there is a tone of melancholy that partly is affected. Now, one of the figures who does this, and I think it's really an extraordinary character or mark of the time, the number of people who live absolutely romantic lives. And of course, one of them is Byron. But they not only live them, they live them with complete self-consciousness. Byron was one of the first people in the world who was seriously worried about his image. He wanted to be the romantic hero, and he is. He became a hero to everyone, not because of virtue, you see, but because of the intensity of his life, and because of the mystery of his being crippled. See, the romantic hero can afford and really should have some kind of wound, and Byron has. And he should also have a sense of revolution. Byron dies in his attempt to join the Greek Revolution. So he fulfills this, but he knew it. He was so conscious of it. He had a tendency to be fat and the romantic hero has to be thin. He also has to be pale. So Byron would retire and eat nothing but onion soup until he was sufficiently pale and thin to appear in public again. Now, you see that's something which is so modern here that you can't believe it. I mean, it's something we think of as belonging really even to the last 50 years rather than to the last 200. But it's exactly what Byron did, and always lived as if someone were writing his biography, and plenty of people have. But he in himself, he really was writing it himself as he lived it. And he changed the way people dressed because they imitated the way he dressed, and he dressed in black for that quality of melancholy. And he used a white shirt with a Byronic collar. And what he did was then set the pattern of the way men were going to dress for the next nearly 100 years, really 100 years. They were going to wear dark suits and white collars, and it's Byron's invention, really. He had the gift of understanding what it was to be this kind of thing, and obviously this person is imitating it. Let's look at the next one. Here's another young man, this is called. Now, the eccentricity in dress, and particularly, of course, eccentricity in hair, because that's always one of the things that is a sign for people and a sign for the world, whether it was Samson or whoever it is, or the monks shaving the tops of their head. The hair has this enormous emotional quality that conveys things. It has really a symbolic quality. And Bulwer Lytton, who was one of the popular writers of the time, always appeared in a sort of robe with long hair, which he dyed yellow, which very clearly dyed yellow. He was always accompanied by a young lady carrying a harp. And you see, what he was doing was writing his biography. I mean, he was performing his life. And that's one of the things which the romantic artist is very apt to do any time. And you can see this young man not only performing his life, but he's imitating Napoleon. So he's got his hand tucked into his vest in the same way. It became this wonderfully, and he's as pale as can be. Looks as though he's about to die of some disease, which was thought of as a wonderful thing. See, a lot of people died of tuberculosis, and they were always particularly pleased with this. There was a longing for death as a kind of peak experience. And there was a longing for ill health. Let's look at the next one. Now there is Jerry Coe, who lived his wonderful life. There's his portrait the year before he dies. He was a devoted horseman. And the horse becomes one of the symbolic romantic animals. And let's look at the next slide. And you can see here, this is also by Jerry Coe, and it's called The Race of the Riderless Horses. And that is that's a kind of quintessential romantic idea. The horse represents a power, it represents and has throughout all history the animal that is tamed but never really tamed. That submits to man, its enormous strength and its fiery nature, and is never really tamed. So that the horse stands in the mind of the whole period as an image of this power of power just held in check. And of course, all the animals take on for the romantic, because the animals are not in the slightest bit civilized. They are not bound by anything that's going to prevent their emotions from expressing themselves. And then if you get wild horses, and then you get wild horses racing, you get the full sense of this, of the unbridled aspect of Romanticism. Let's look at the next, and these were real races that they had in Italy of horses that had never been broken and never ridden, and they were simply raced on a course that kept them going all along the same course. And here's another painting of exactly the same subject. And let's look at the next one. And there is something of the young men running with a horse, you see. And it is again that the sense it's a strong, the identification with animals, the delight in animals, the feeling that animals have some kind of a marvelous, beautiful soul, because they have no reasoning powers, because they are not limited by civilization, that therefore they have this sort of grandeur, this spiritual grandeur and limitlessness. Let's look at the next one. And Jericho paints that's a race in England, a steeplechase, and it was in a steeplechase that he was hurt, and was the cause of his death. But he was devoted to steeplechasing, and he was devoted also, as many people were at this time, to the English sense of the horse and the English in general. They had become a kind of, to French people, they looked much more romantic in the real sense of romantic, partly because of their gardens, partly because they lived in the country. Their nobility lived in the country. Let's look at the next one. And another figure that's always so delightful to the romantic is the soldier, and the soldier on horseback. See, what the soldier on horseback represents is a life lived at risk, a life which is dangerous, and which is therefore filled with the kind of emotion and the kind of imaginative extravagance that the romantic loves. And so over and over you have the mounted soldier. Let's look at the next one. And also the wounded soldier with his horse. And that sense of the sense of illness, the sense of the wound, and of the presence of death are all things that have an irresistible appeal to the romantic imagination. The romantic wishes to die young, and the great romantic poets all did, except Wordsworth, and poor Wordsworth might have wished he had, because his poetic qualities diminished as he aged, since what he was writing was lyric romantic poetry, which belongs really to youth. And so not to die young was a serious blow to the poetic powers. Let's look at the next one. Horses, just for their own sake, you see. Not any story with them, not any mythology about them, simply the horse. Exactly as over and over. Let's look at the next one. Oh my, there's a horse frightened, but frightened into standing on his head almost, frightened of a thunderstorm. And of course, let's look at the next one, and we'll look. Maybe you can fix that one without too much trouble. I don't know. But you see what a wonderful thing this is, just a portrait of a horse. And when can that ever happen? You see, it can't possibly happen as long as some narrative is going on in life, when there's a kind of coherence to the stories which people are concerned with, so that now something which just stands for, exactly as the people in their lives stand for a certain attitude. The horse stands for this, and therefore is painted exactly as you would paint a saint. It is one of the animals, or in a way the saints of the romantic world. And let's look at the next one. And they all are such romantic-looking animals, you know. They always, because the great features of the romantic are the eyes and the mouth. And the eyes should be large and glowing and sparkling. I mean, not sparkling with laughter, but glowing. And the mouth should be mobile and disconsolate. And animals can fulfill that very easily. And particularly horses, and I think also this bulldog. Now see, this is the first time in the history of painting that somebody simply looked at a bulldog and painted a picture of the bulldog, nothing but his head. Not because he's somebody's pet and they want a whole picture of him instead of a photograph. No, he is his own justification for being. His unique sense of being a bulldog is sufficient to raise him to this kind of sainthood. And let's look at the next one, and I could show you how many of these, you know. This is a cat. And again, it is a respect for. It's not really a respect as much as an awe in front of the animal, because what the animal does without any effort is what the romantic wants to do, and it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of effort to be perfectly natural, you see, because there's so much going on that keeps you from it. And how can he be as uninhibited as an animal? How can he be as natural as an animal? Well, it takes a lot of work. But the animal has no trouble with it at all. It can just be perfectly so. Let's look at the next one. It's a marvelous painting, isn't it? Wonderful, the cat. And Géricault paints one of the terrible myths of Greece of Hippolytus, who refused the love of a lady, and his horses turned on him and ate him. Now, there's you see, a peak experience for you, and it may have been one for the horses for all I know. I'm sure they must have been possessed by something, because they're strict vegetarians in life. But here they are, devouring him. And you see the way this is painted is as the same kind. Let's look at the next slide. You have a detail of this. The way this is painted has the same kind of intensity and suddenness, the same business of short time. You feel that there's a pressure of time, and that whatever happens has to happen with great spontaneity and immediately, or the moments pass. It's a very strong sense of the lack of duration really being something which is deadening, and duration being something which is undesirable, and really removes all the things that you want. That you want that feeling of freshness, of spontaneity, of immediacy, of something which is not contrived and not thought about or planned, because then it doesn't spring entirely from the emotions. It doesn't spring only from the imagination. Let's look at the next slide. One of the, again, like the bulldog, you see, this person is not a famous person. He has no kind of meaning. He has only that valuable meaning of a look of suffering and a look of age, so that he can act symbolically for the artist, and he can act that way in this picture by symbolizing the mystery of age, approaching death, even of illness, because there's a great strong quality of illness in this face. And let's look at the next slide. And here's a young soldier. Now, when I say that this is a story that we still tell and that we still live by, this could be anyone painted in the last, and the way it's painted, it could have been painted in the last 20 years easily. And the person that you see here is really the Hemingway person. That is, he's the soldier, he's the macho, but suffering nonetheless, with his deep-set eyes and his look of fatality. It's something, one of the great joys of Romanticism is that you're never responsible for anything, because it's either fate or it is the power of the emotions which have made you do whatever it is that you did. So that you have no sense whatever of any kind of burden of guilt or burden of responsibility. You are a creature of fate, or you are a creature of your passions. And your passions are meant to be stronger than you are. They're meant to be that way. And if they aren't stronger than you, it's because you're inhibiting them, and it's because you're preventing yourself from being the full and magnificent creature that you otherwise would be. Let's look at the next slide. Now, also, you see, this is one of the things that happens is that nature, because nature is opposed to civilization, becomes one of the ideals of the Romantic, and everything, therefore, is open to him. Everything, there's no limit to what he's going to look into or try to understand or try to assimilate into his own emotional life. So that Géricault paints these amputated limbs. And in the next slide, let's look at the next one, people who have been guillotined. That's a subject. That's a suitable subject matter for him to paint. Because, first of all, he sees them and they are there in the world. And secondly, they represent an extreme of, think of what goes behind it, all of the horror, the fear, the terror, and the death. And so these decapitated heads, and they kind of shiver of our own experience when we look at them, that it's something which inevitably, this cultivation of the emotions inevitably leads to a cultivation of violence, and to the pleasure in seeing violence for its own sake, because violence moves us, and no matter how much we exhaust our emotions in various ways, we still respond to a certain extent, at least, to violence. Let's look at the next slide. And to madness, because much of what, for the Romantic, madness takes on some of the same kind of dignity and some kind of the same mysterious fascination that animals have. Because these are people who are not going along the path of civilization. They're going along some mysterious, unknowable, perhaps even totally inaccessible world. And Géricault painted these for a doctor friend who was interested in the face of madness. And this is a woman who's envious. Her madness was envy. And let's look at the next one. And hers was gambling. And these were actual patients, you see. Patients of this doctor. And these are in a way, clinical. Well, they're that great. Business is the case histories. They are the thing that you see, and that then you know about this. The title is on them. And you know that this is her. Her insanity is gambling. Let's look at the next one. And his is kleptomania. See, it's a sense that there's a kind of greed of learning or a greed of curiosity that makes you want to see everything and makes you want to experience everything, and that allows you then to go as far as you possibly can into areas that have not been, that were really disagreeable or frightening. And now they're brought in to experience, to accelerate it, to stimulate it. Let's look at the next one. Here's a man with delusions of grandeur, military grandeur. And the way in which they are like other people, the way in which they are unlike other people, these two things constitute the fascination which they have, of course, for the beholder, and had for Jericho, and had for the doctor. Let's look at the next one. Now, the great delight of the Romantic is always the child, because the child has not yet been corrupted, so that since it's uncivilized. And the Romantic idea is that it is absolutely good. The child is absolutely good. One of the shocks of Freud's theories was to see the child as not good, but see the child as wrought with the same emotions and the same terrors and the same unsuitable desires as anyone. And the Romantic, instead, you see, believing that we really are good, believes that the child is the hope of everything. And if you can keep the child from being corrupted by the society, then you'll have heaven on earth. You'll have a utopia. You'll have Arcadia. And so here you have the child and the animal, two great icons of the Romantic. And all of the little Victorian children that pictures fill up the rest of the 19th century spring from this child. And the kind of saccharine innocence and charm that she's supposed to represent, and her linking with the animal, so that both of them stand for everything that was desirable, the untrammeled, the limitless, the infinite feeling of freedom, which the escape from society, or the moment before you've been introduced to society, gives people. Let's look at the next one. There's another child. And again, it's a Romantic child. It's a child of this kind of softness and this wonderful look of purity and virtue, even carried to such an extreme that it has an angelic look. And it was people felt, you remember Wordsworth, of course, that heaven lies about us in our infancy. It was a real conviction that the child was direct from heaven, and that it was an example for all of us of purity and emotional sweetness, a kind of nobility or beauty of soul. And that persists, of course, right to the present day. We still feel that the child is some way something that we can live more brilliantly through. That we can, if we can only get people educated, if we can only prevent them from being distorted by what they learn, that their natural goodness, the natural goodness of the child will triumph over all of the pains and sorrows of the world. It's possible to hold that view despite the continuous evidence to the contrary. And it's so exact as it's possible to hold the view that all people are really essentially good. Let's look at the next slide. Now, another thing which Jericho does, and that is one of the first times, see, the sense that nature is benign and powerful. Nature really becomes a divine idea. Means that the artist and everyone else must turn to nature for knowledge. And so the artist literally submits himself to the natural world insofar as he possibly can. This is part of this gets the whole great interest in landscape painting, but part of it becomes a way in which the artist submits his imagination to the thing which he sees in the natural world. And he tries to make that as clear as it possibly can be. This is a painting called The Raft of the Medusa, and it was an actual event that one of the merchant ships, French merchant ships, when it was sinking, the officers took all the lifeboats and were saved. And the other people on the boat, they left to drown, and they thought they would. But the other people didn't drown. They made a raft out of what was left of the boat and came to shore and told what had happened. So that it was an enormous scandal. And it was the biggest piece of news. And what Jericho does is go there to paint that. You see, he has this feeling that the sensitivity of the artist being so gifted with this great creative imagination and this powerful emotional sensitivity, the kind of sensitivity that is full of pity and full of intuition into what's happening in other people. And this was something which all of the Romantics felt was absolutely true of the artist, and it's what distinguished the artist from anyone else. But anyone who had that kind of pity was felt to belong to the elite of the emotional life. In fact, there's a wonderful statement by one of the Romantics who said that if a horse steps aside rather than tread on a toad, he is holier than Socrates. See, it's an extravagance of adoration, really, of the emotional and sympathetic life, in which you're able to feel that this is the true value, the true purpose of life is to feel, and to feel these things strongly. So Jericho goes and interviews. It's such a wonderful kind of modern thing. He goes and interviews the people who were saved, who were on the raft of the Medusa. He draws all of them, he talks to them, he listens to their stories, and then he paints this picture, which was a large life-size painting and caused a tremendous stir because of the excitement around it, the scandalous excitement around it. And now, when we look at it, it looks to us almost as dramatically conceived as David. And it is, you see, it has a compositional arrangement. This is a sketch for it. And if you look at that, and you see how it's arranged, you see the sail, you see he takes that moment when they see a ship and they are signaling to it. Now then, look at the finished picture. Let's look at the next slide. You see, everything now is dramatically arranged, so that though what he sees, he actually went and studied and interviewed and painted the people, but he turns them into something else. He turns them into figures, almost classical figures. He arranges them in such ways that they make an arrangement out of their bodies and out of the upward sweep toward the sail, and the way the sail itself now catches the wind. See, before it was just hanging down. So that everything is brought into a dramatic quality. Everything is raised to a dramatic intensity. And this painting was so popular. That people at that time, the way that you really earned money by painting was by showing it, exhibiting it in a place where people paid money to go in, and you dropped the money at the door, like a show. And he traveled all over France with it, and he traveled to England with it, where it was immensely popular, and where he made a lot of money from exhibiting this, because it exactly appealed, you see, exactly as it would now. I mean, the event was scandalous, was astounding, was absolutely unexpected, took on a kind of miraculous character, and the painting itself was a docudrama. It was something which was carefully presented as real, as true. and yet is still an intensely dramatic kind of thing. So that he fulfills in his painting this extraordinary romantic vision in everything. And because of that, though he lived such a very short time, he had an enormous influence on subsequent painters. And really, it isn't until the Impressionists that you get away from the style that he has. Let me show you the next painting, which is by one of the very great painter, much more famous painter, Delacroix, Eugène Delacroix. And here you have a perfect romantic painting. It's romantic because it's from what's happening. It's called the death of Ashurbanipal. And the Orient fascinated people, romantic people, because it seemed to them more exotic, more passionate, much more emotional, obviously was not so influenced by Descartes, and had therefore a mysterious charm. So that the Orient always represents in the 19th and late 18th and 19th century something which is remote and desirable and more satisfying than any other area of the world. And so this death, and when the great kings, this is Ashurbanipal, the Syrian king, when they died, all of their women and all of their horses were killed. And so Delacroix takes that moment, which of course is a great, again, great romantic moment. See that it gives him the opportunity to show these women about to be killed or actually killed, the king lying there, really above it all because he's nearly dying. You see, so that he has this great majestic view of the world, of all this carnage going on, the horses being brought into his bedroom to be killed, which would certainly add to the general confusion, and everything about it is sumptuous and violent and voluptuous, and all of the things that strike and exalt the romantic imagination. And it is that imagination that still survives and that still is attached to the artist. And even in its manner of expressing itself, it is not forgotten. Thank you very much.
No idea, and I still don't understand why one should be so embarrassed at making some kind of a cake upon your purses. But you have an extremely elegant, I hope most of you have an extremely elegant little piece of pasteboard, which I'm trying to force into your hand. And what it says is something which I think is unacceptable, no, not unacceptable, delightful, truthful, the treasure. And the only reason why I'm mentioning it is simply I have a horror of sailing under false pretenses. And we are circulating a little book in which you would be kind enough to write your addresses. Not so that anybody will come to your door with a pistol and say, hand over the dibs or something. It became clear that quite a number of people who very much wanted to know when these lectures occurred had not received a suitable message by a suitable grapevine. And so if we have addresses, then next year a preliminary announcement should arrive without any let or hindrance. But at the same time, I do want to say that my heart is set upon trying to raise enough money to perpetuate in one form or another these delightful evenings, which seem to be quite unlike anything else that goes on in Santa Cruz. Infinitely more warm, infinitely more joyous, infinitely more amusing, infinitely more enlightening, infinitely more friendly, and just the sort of thing that a real university exists to encourage and foster. And of course you can't do it unless you have a lovely warm fire. But it would be a terrible shame not to keep blowing upon, I won't say these embers, because that's obviously not true, but this flaming and tremendous bonfire. So what we want you to do is keep a little bit of help so the nasty administrative bellows of the university don't inadvertently do the wrong kind of thing. I hope you don't feel in any way insulted, put out by such a simple and I hope reasonably direct request to you to think how nice it would be to raise the appropriate monument to the appropriate monument.
Thank you, Jasper. Well, I hope your cookies are getting at least partway down the room. And I really have it's such a problem to talk to you tonight about what I want to talk to you about, because it's something which is so close to us and something which is so much actually a part of us that it's very difficult to talk about. It isn't easy to see it at any kind of a distance, and yet it's something which is, I think, one of the most extraordinary and important things about the time that we live in. About, in the middle of the 18th century, a most extraordinary thing happened. A whole new song, or new poem, or new idea, new myth arose. Really was written and spoken, and we know to a great extent a single person is responsible for it, and it's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what he did was make an astounding statement that is nobody else at any time or at any place ever really believed. He said that we, as human beings, are born good. And all of our training makes us bad. Everything that, like our society, our civilization, makes us bad. And if we could only throw those things off and do away with any kind of limits, that the world would be a sunny and marvelous and delightful place, because everybody is really very, very good. Now, almost everybody in interpreting human beings has thought that they're really very, very bad. The whole Judeo-Christian idea that we are fallen, this is a fallen world, and we're fallen people, has a lot of support from time to time. In your own self, I'm sure, and as you look around you. Even in the Orient, the idea that we are good automatically is the farthest thing from what they think. The whole aim of life should be to correct and alter and change and perfect insofar as you possibly can. And that really the only way that you can be good is by dissolving utterly, disappearing. So this idea is really, it's just like it's like a thunderbolt, and it struck the world in that way. Now, there were ways in which it was built up to. There were other people suggesting something about it, but essentially, that idea springs from Rousseau. And it is something which we have never really altered. Now, what is this that we can be that's so good? Well, the thing that we are when we're good is we follow our emotions, we follow our feelings, We don't let anything trammel us. We live in a very intense and powerful way. And that means that we just move from one experience to another with the aim of our lives being the intensity of the experience. Now, if that's true, and when it seems to be true, it is, of course, wonderfully heartening and a wonderfully easy thing to live up to. You just, you don't need to do anything except not do something. You have to avoid civilization as much as you can. You have to make, in fact, a rapturous assault on anything that's like order, and you have to be satisfied only by the ferocity and violence and intensity of your emotional life. Now, that's an idea which, in all of its kind of descents and strange alterations, is still one of the master ideas that we all live under and all expect. It is an idea which undermines the idea of happiness, which is, over and over, all kinds of civilizations and people and philosophies have thought that happiness was the end of life, the aim of life. But this actually undermines the idea of happiness, because happiness is relatively smooth and even and joyful and quiet. And what Rousseau says, life must be instead in peaks and valleys. It must be in the intensity and excitement of life, and it must be something which which floods your whole being, so that you are unable to think of anything except that. Now, why is this? Why are we so good? Well, it's because, according to him, the only thing that we really must always assure ourselves of and be conscious of is that we are unique. There's nothing like us. Now, increasingly, people felt that the more unique you were, the better, until it went to, of course, the extremes of how unique, which has been finally, of course, how eccentric, how extraordinary, how absolutely far away from anything which is a center or anything which is a shared experience. The man, as Rousseau sees him, doesn't share experience. He simply has experience. And his great genius is that he has more and more intense experiences than other people. That if he achieves the quality of genius, that this is because he's not like anyone, and that he's also not in any way imitating anything. It's the idea that life without passion has no value, and that the whole aim is to sustain passions. Well, of course, they can't be. So you cannot live, and everybody knows it, and Rousseau knew it, and everybody since then has known it. No matter what you wish, you cannot live constantly on the peaks of the emotional life. They do not last. They can't be peaks if they do last, you see, because then they become plateaus and then finally a level ground. So it's impossible to maintain this kind of thing, and consequently it means that you move toward more and more experience of this, so stronger and stronger experience. You long for more and more and stronger experience. And that, of course, means you've got to do all kinds of things like change constantly, because otherwise you get used to whatever's going on. And you've got also to, almost always, you've got to sort of stimulate your emotional life. And it may be with drugs, and it may be with alcohol, it may be anything that intensifies and sharpens and makes more limitless the kind of experience you have, because that's one of the words really that the followers of Rousseau liked better than any, was the idea of limitlessness, and that people must seek what is unlimited. It's a kind of spiritual greed, or a greed that feels that there's never really enough. You see, there's not ever going to be enough of whatever it is, and you therefore you want more and more. You need more and more excitements, more and more stimulations. You have more and more extravagant and amazing experiences which don't last and aren't intended to. There's a wonderful example of that in Berlioz. Berlioz was in Italy, and he got a letter from the mother of the woman that he loved, and she said that her daughter had married somebody else. Well, Berlioz went into a roaring rage, as he said. People thought he was a madman, and he paced around and screamed. He loaded his pistols, packed up a disguise as a lady's maid, and set out for Paris to shoot the mother and the daughter and himself. Well, he got as far as Nice, and it was a beautiful day, and he didn't go any farther. You see, but he'd had this whole wonderful, intense experience in the sense that he was living at an absolutely at the extremes of life, at the most enviably unique and singular. He was poised, you see, to become a murderer and a suicide. But he was, and of course, deflected by the fact that the sun was shining. So it's that kind of, and he was not ashamed of this, He had no sense that this was something that showed a little instability. He felt that he was living as any proper person should, you see, because he was giving away to this emotion and that emotion, and finding that they were all equally delicious, you see. His dallying in Nice was just as nice as his angers and pacing around and frightening all the people in Italy. So it's a kind of it's a marvelous, like a dream. See, life becomes a kind of dream, and that's very comforting and easy. In fact, Rousseau said something that I think is we all understand. He said, it's awfully hard to think, and it's just wonderful to daydream. Yes, that's true, but he thought that because this was true, then everybody should daydream. See, they shouldn't bother to think, because why should you do anything else? And there's no answer why you should do anything else from him. Now, part of the reason, let's look at the slide. Part of the reason that this was so overwhelming to people, this idea, was not only its novelty, but also its the fact that it occurs against what was a very different kind of world. It occurs against really not only Christian thought, which had reached a point that was emphasizing the depravity of man. That was the phrase that was used. More than any other aspect of Christianity. And that the only hope of salvation was an absolutely ascetic life and a complete withdrawal from the world. But in addition to that, one of the major ideas of the 17th century had been the value of reason and the value of the material actuality of the material world. It comes from Descartes, and as you remember, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. And he not only says that, you see, but he goes on to say that anything which can't be measured and weighed really has no existence. You don't have to fool with it. be a part of the physical world, it has no meaning. The only thing that has meaning is reason about the things which you can physically experience. So the combination of that idea, which by the 18th century had gotten to be very much turned into something that had more to do with reasonableness than reasoning. And the ideal of the 18th century was manners and propriety and decorum in a very special and superficial way. Now, this wasn't only the aristocracy that felt this way. It was also everybody felt that there was a kind of an obligation to be sensible and to be cautious and polite and not to pay any attention to the emotional life. Now, in this painting, you have a wonderful example of what people thought was the right way to live, and that was to have to be as pretty as possible and dress as nicely as possible, and simply flirt. Now, it's a great thing because at Versailles, you could always go to Versailles if you had on nice clothes. You didn't have to be invited or anything or know anybody. You just had to be nicely dressed. And so you could then go and sport around with the king. And these people are beautifully dressed, and they're also at Versailles. And what are they doing? You see, they're just playing. And the idea of play, and particularly the idea of erotic play, was one of the great joys of the 18th century, as you know. It became a kind of feminized century, women very powerful and devoted to this kind of charm. Let's look at the next one, because I could show you 1,000 of them, and I know you've already seen in your life a lot of them. It's the same theme, you see, and has wonderful titles like The Citadel Under Attack. And there it is, you see, The Citadel Under Attack. And you see how wonderfully dainty the men have gotten, as well as the women. And they wear beautiful satins and silks, and they have an aim, really, is this kind of idle pursuit. In the 18th century, it was considered a disgrace if you fell in love with anyone. It was also considered a disgrace if you didn't have any sex life. Well, if you didn't have any, you pretended you had. And it was common for people to paint circles under their eyes and go around saying, la la, I don't get enough sleep. And then everybody would commiserate with you and know what you were saying, you see. That it was, that you were partaking of what was the right way to live, the only correct way to live. But if you fell in love with anybody, and if, worst of all, you fell in love with your husband, it was a disaster, because it was considered vulgar. It was something which very common people might conceivably do, but that you would never do. And any kind of attachment to your children was thought equally vulgar, really. Coarse, common, showed no kind of refinement of nature at all. And so children were sent away almost as soon as they were born to wet nurses in the country, and didn't come back till they were 7 years old. Then they were put into convents or military establishments, depending on the sex. So the patter of little feet was not a large interest in the 18th century. And let's look at the next slide. There was the whole society really went on a marvelous sense of intrigue and sense of things happening secretly. This lady receiving a love letter in flowers. Someone had sent her flowers, and It's a love letter in it. And the little dog, she and the dog are involved in this excitement and this fascinating moment of the love affair. And the way that she looks at us, you see, is one with absolute, and there's no question of her sighing with love. She's just delighted that this is going to happen, but it's not anything which involves her emotions in the slightest. Only the emotion of excitement, not of anything deeper than that. Let's look at the next slide. And here's a marvelous one because it's called The Stolen Kiss. And you see, she's been in the room there, and she says, "La, it's getting cold in here," because she knows exactly at what time, by the beautiful little clock on the mantel, that her lover will come to the back door. And she says, "I must go get my shawl," and so she goes then to get her shawl, you see. But it's really for an assignation with him. So, but this was the delight of the time. It was the charm and the delight and the playfulness, which, of course, was constantly threatened with boredom. But it was always an effort to overcome that by the changing of partners and so on. Let's look at the next slide. And it was intended. This is called the lock, and it is now. The amour is about to be satisfied, and let's look at the next one, because this is called the longed-for moment. And it is, you see, the emphasis on this, on first of all the kind of capture of the citadel, and also that now this moment is the thing. It's not the longed-for woman. It's not the longed-for love. It's not the longed-for anything but the moment. So that this keeps all of the emotion from becoming too strong at any time. Let's look at the next slide. And then there's this sense that life is a kind of dream, but it's a dream of Arcady. It's a dream of the shepherd and the shepherdess. Has, of course, absolutely nothing to do with any kind of reality at all, but people are willing to believe in it. I think it's one of the most ancient dreams of man to be a shepherd with a beautiful shepherdess and recline among the sheep and listen to music. And there is nothing, of course, in almost no way that this can be arranged. So, but it keeps on plaguing people. They keep on coming back to this as a beautiful idea, as a possible idea. And the whole wonderfully delicate and cloud-like people that are involved with this. Let's look at the next slide. And then in the middle of the century, you begin to have a curious kind of sentimental morality occurring. As it's really through the exhaustion of the immorality, the exhaustion of the sense that nothing can be immoral, that nothing can be a great remark of I think it was Chesterton who said, the proper life is lived with the appearance of virtue and all the solid satisfaction of vice. And that was the ideal, you see, that you should have the appearance of manners and virtue, and at the same time. And it wasn't exactly hypocrisy, you see, because they weren't really trying to fool anyone. It was a willing splitting of your attitude both toward yourself and toward the world. So you get also a kind of playing at the moral life, exactly as you play at the life of the shepherdess, you play at the moral life. And here you have a young lady who's gone, as they say, once too often to the well, and it's called the broken pitcher. And you see she's not really very devastated by this alteration in her life. And let's look at the next one. This is called the morning prayer. And you can't help wondering what she's praying for. It doesn't, it's so marvelous that the conscious meaninglessness of this is such a wonderful thing to think of people looking at this and thinking it has anything to do with prayer of any kind. It has something to do with sort of wishing, but not with prayer. And her absolute satisfaction that everyone is looking at her and that she looks very pretty and properly pious. And there's no sense, the feeling is, of course, that this is a performance. And life became a kind of performance in this, in much of the 18th century. Let's look at the next slide. And here's another wonderful moral venture. This is called the father's curse. And the son his mother's trying to hold him back, all of his sisters. He's trying to get out of that house, and you can't blame him for a peaceful minute, you see. All those little swarming children, and the mother and the father looking extremely disagreeable. And after this was painted, let's look at the next one. Then you have the sequel, the kind of Ramo 2 and 3. And because back comes the son, and this is called, he's come too late. But the father's dying, and you see, just look at the gestures. They're so marvelous, they're so, because what this is melodrama. This is not drama, this is melodrama, and it's not anything having to do with any kind of stringency or any kind of moral comprehension at all. It is simply taking advantage of easy emotions, light, frivolous, and easy emotions, and exactly as it takes advantage of extreme and extravagant gestures that of course are worn absolutely thin, but this time they were worn thin. I like the dog best because he wants to get out of there much more than anybody else, and he's headed for the door. He's been my favorite for years. I just love him. But there's Papa's already expired, and all those children who don't seem to have grown a great deal, still hanging around and weeping. And of course the son is just devastated. He's come back too late for his father's blessing. Let's look at the next one. These are painted by a man named Grizz, who this is also a wonderfully delightful one. It's called The Drunkard Comes Home. And you see, look at it's supposed to turn you against drink, but I don't think that it exactly would, because he looks much happier than the others, and really obviously is. And those little Solomon pietistic children are never going to turn him from his wicked ways. And let's look at the next one. Now, that kind of I don't know what to call it. It's kind of like a pseudo-morality or a pseudo-dramatic understanding of the serious aspects of life. But that undergoes a much greater, strong alteration, in part because of the excavations at the time, in the middle of the 18th century and toward the end of it. It's when Pompeii was dug up, and people became aware of the meaning of civilization falling, of civilization having a great moment and then declining. And that idea was made very clear to them because by the excavations, people could get a sense of the ordinary life of the time, of the Roman time. Now, they had always known about all through the Middle Ages. They'd continued stories of Rome and stories of the people of Rome and some knowledge of it, and of course a great deal of the ruins of Rome were still perfectly visible. But to see the excavations and to see what ordinary life was and how it was lived, it made an enormous impression on people, because for the first time they realized that there was such a thing as a perfectly integrated and powerful world, the world of Rome. It actually could disappear. It could be lost, could be gone. And this was such a powerful idea that people began that endless question, which is still goes on and still is unanswered, is why did Rome fall? And many people felt that it had fallen for exactly the same reasons that sustained life in the 18th century. That is, that they were really on the verge of seeing their own civilization follow in the path of Rome. Because the quality of late Roman life, the extremely indulgent and sensual life of Rome, I think it's something which I always tell people the only way you can really understand it is to realize that every dining room in every palace in Rome had right next to it a vomitorium. And that was because the human being is so limited in his physical self that he can't eat more than about 2 dinners at once. And therefore, how are you going to really enjoy life? Well, you have to vomit up one of the dinners. And so they had a vomitorium built next to the dining room, and you would say, excuse me, between courses, go out and vomit and come back with renewed interest in your dinner. And that is characteristic. You see, that really goes all through the kind of really extravagant sense of the exploitation of the physical nature of the human being. How can at least every kind of possible delight be squeezed from our bodies, which, as you know, are very limited? You can't live in but one house at once. Most things you can't do at once. You see, that's it. And then you have to wait. Well, the Romans never wanted to wait. They wanted to be able to eat like gods, that is, endlessly, and then and not feel any of the pains of that. And of course, there was the same way about sexuality, same way about all of the appetites of the body. But before that, at the time of the Republic, or earlier, very little earlier, Rome was a moral model to the world. It depended on a very strict moral relations between everyone. It had the most austere sense of what they call gravitas, that is the seriousness of life, the heaviness, weightiness of life. And any kind of frivolity was so frowned on. So that people turned back to the classical world in its zenith. And they turned to Greece, they turned to Rome at their high points, and felt that if they could inculcate these same virtues in their own society, that it would be saved from destruction or saved from ruin. And so paintings and literature began to try to present models of behavior. And this, of course, very famous